President of the American Antiquarian Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before I introduce Jill Lepore to speak about her new book on King Philip's War, let me say a few words about the circumstances that bring this audience and this speaker together here in this place. For our C-SPAN viewers, a geography lesson may be helpful. We are gathered in Worcester, Massachusetts, the second largest city in New England, situated some 40 miles west of Boston. Most of the incidents of the bloody conflict of 1675 and 1676, about which we will hear, took place in towns and villages which lie within 50 miles of this very spot. King Philip's War is local history in these parts. For some of us, it is also family history, as those who fought and died included our ancestors, Algonquin and English. The events of more than 300 years ago are thus of continuing personal interest to many here tonight. The room in which we have assembled is, by day, the busy library reading room of the American Antiquarian Society. We were founded in 1812 as the first national historical organization in the country, and we continue to this day to actively and comprehensively collect, organize, preserve, and make available for use books, newspapers, manuscripts, and graphic images from throughout the nation, which document American history and culture through the year 1876. The oft-asked question, why Worcester and not Boston, Philadelphia, or New York for a national institution, is easy to answer. In 1812, Worcester was favored for its inland location, safely out of the range of the British fleet. Inaccessible then, we have earned today the reputation as one of the most accessible research libraries of our type. Each year, thousands of scholars, teachers, students, writers, artists, filmmakers, and other historical researchers venture to the Society to study in these unparalleled collections, to take advantage of the expertise of our generous staff, and to participate in the vital community of scholarship which thrives here. The readers and fellows of the Society include many of the foremost scholarly historians of early American history, and I am pleased to see a number of them in our audience tonight as well. Here, readers and researchers learn from each other, not only in formal presentations like this one, but in friendly exchanges over a cup of coffee or a shared meal. For generations, the Antiquarian Society has been a place where professional and amateur historians have benefited from each other's company, as will no doubt be the case again this evening. Jill Lepore first entered into our company in the spring of 1993, when she was awarded a Peterson Fellowship to support research here at the Antiquarian Society on her dissertation at Yale University, and delightful company she has been. Jill is now Assistant Professor of History at Boston College, and, as you know, her dissertation has become a highly acclaimed new book, The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, just published by Alfred A. Knopf. The praise for her work has been extraordinary, especially for a first-time author. Reviewers have called the book brilliant, profound, and rewarding. Jill Lepore has burst onto the scholarly scene with a tour de force production, which surprises none of us who have had the pleasure of working with her. It is thus a high honor for me to present Jill Lepore on behalf of the Society as a former fellow and a fast friend. Jill?
Good evening. I'd like to thank Ellen and the Antiquarian Society for inviting me here this evening, and thank all of you, especially those of you who are standing, which is going to make me tempted to run through my words so that you can have some relief at the end of my talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. In some sense, it's a triple pleasure to be here this evening. First of all, it's great to be giving this talk here at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester because so much of King Philip's War took place in central Massachusetts. Secondly, it's great to be here because so much of my research was done here at the American Antiquarian Society. And thirdly, it's a pleasure to be here because Worcester is my hometown, and this is in many ways a homecoming for me. So again, thank you for coming. I'd like to begin this evening with a story and a paradox. One brisk autumn evening in 1831, some 200 or so Worcesterites assembled in a hall not too far from here to honor Worcester's history. After music, a parade led by the governor, and a sumptuous dinner, members of the Worcester Historical Society offered a series of prepared and to us rather peculiar toasts for the evening. They toasted the day, the personal estates of our ancestors, the old colony. They made a toast to the inhabitants of Worcester County and to the ancient dowry of a farmer's daughter, a bed, a cow, a spinning wheel, and a cradle. And they made, to me, the most peculiar toast of the evening. In 1831, these well-heeled Worcester men offered a toast to King Philip. Had we lived in the days of our forefathers, as an enemy we would have slain him, but today the present generation may safely express their respect for his patriotism. Now that last is quite a toast. And here's the paradox of it. How could these very well-heeled Worcester men so baldly declare both their admiration for Philip and their zeal to kill him if they'd had the chance? We might allow perhaps that they were a little bit more drunken at the time when they came up with this toast, but I'm not sure that that explains it fully to us. And I hope that by the end of my talk this evening, we'll have arrived at an answer to this seeming paradox. But for now, let me make explicit some of the points that I'm going to be trying to make in this evening's discussion of King Philip's War. I believe that King Philip's War shows us that how we remember wars, how those men in 1831 remembered a war from over a century earlier, how we remember wars can be just as important as how we wage them in the first place. King Philip's War nearly caused the English colonists to abandon New England entirely, nearly ended the social experiment of the Puritans' city on a hill that laid the foundations for the American nation. How those 17th century English colonists and their Indian enemies made sense of this devastating war, and how their descendants have remembered, and in some cases forgotten, that war, reveals a great deal about how American identity is formed. And it is formed, I believe, out of the sometimes gracious, sometimes awkward, sometimes brutal encounters between the peoples who come to face one another on American soil. So there will be three parts to my talk this evening. I want to talk first of all about how the war was waged, secondly about how the colonists wrote about the war, how the war was written, and finally about how the war has been remembered. King Philip's War, of course, it must be said at the outset, was named after a Wampanoag Indian sachem who took the English name of Philip and whom the colonists referred to as a king. His Indian name, his Algonquin Indian name earlier in his life was Metacom, and some records call him by that name, just for clarification's purposes. The war began in June of 1675, when three men were hanged by the neck not too far from Plymouth Rock. They had been convicted of murdering a man named John Sassaman, who weeks before his death had warned the governor of Plymouth Colony that Philip was planning to wage a war against the English settlers. The three convicted men, all Wampanoags loyal to Philip, were suspected of killing Sassaman, a Christian Indian minister who had studied at Harvard, as punishment for his betrayal. On the gallows, the two accused Wampanoags died the slow, jerky death of strangulation, but the third was saved when his rope frayed as it dangled and finally dropped him to the ground. To the Puritans it was no matter, and to the English it was no matter either, because two deaths were more than enough to start a war. Whatever his original intentions, Philip began attacking English towns on June 24th, 1675, just days after his men were hanged. Over the next 14 months, one English town was laid waste after another. In July, Middleborough, Dartmouth, Plymouth, and Mendon were attacked. Brookfield in August, Springfield, Hatfield, and Northampton in October. Then, in winter, Patuxent, Lancaster, Medfield, Groton, Longmeadow, Marlborough, Simsbury, Providence. Still more the following summer. It seemed to the colonists as if the Indians had risen almost round the country. And indeed, as the war progressed, other northeastern Algonquins, Nipmucks and Pecumtucks in central and western Massachusetts, Narragansetts in Rhode Island, and later Abnakis in Maine, joined Philip's campaign or fought the English for reasons of their own. By August of 1676, when Philip was shot to death near his home in Mount Hope, 25 English towns, more than half of all the colonists' settlements in New England, had been ruined, and the line of English habitation had been pushed back almost to the coast. If you think about Massachusetts geography, you can imagine that on the eve of King Philip's War, there were English settlements as far west as Deerfield on the Connecticut River, and by the end of King Philip's War, all English towns west of Concord had been utterly destroyed or abandoned. So the line of English habitation was quite successfully pushed back towards the coast. By the end of the war, the struggling colonists had nearly been forced to abandon New England, and their losses left them desperately dependent on England for support. In proportion to population, King Philip's War was the most fatal war in American history. Yet Indian losses were far greater. Colonial armies with their Pequot and Mohegan allies pursued enemy Indians from Narragansett Bay to the Connecticut River Valley, killing warriors in their fields and families in their homes. Those Algonquins who fought against the English saw their communities decimated. Thousands were killed in the fighting, while thousands more died of disease or starvation, or were shipped out of the colonies to the West Indies to be sold as slaves. Those Indians who retreated beyond the Connecticut River found themselves fighting on two fronts, with their traditional Iroquois enemies, the Mohawks, to the west, and with the English to the east. Closer to the Atlantic, not even Christian Indians loyal to the English were spared. In the fall of 1675, most were removed from their towns and imprisoned on barren islands in Boston Harbor, where many died of cold or hunger during the long winter. Always brutal and everywhere fierce, King Philip's War proved to be not only the most fatal war in American history, but also one of the most merciless. Both sides practiced torture and mutilation of the dead, both killed women and children, and both tormented captives with unspeakable cruelties. And because of the cruelty of King Philip's War, the documents that remain for us are filled with the agony of people who have both suffered under these cruelties and the agony of people who are trying to reconcile themselves with the cruelties that they've inflicted on others. To give you a sense of what these documents look like and how the colonists tried to explain how the war was waged and tried to reckon it for their own purposes, I want to read to you from an inventory of the damage in the war taken by a Boston merchant in July of 1676, and it's a rather lengthy list. Nathaniel Saltonstall, the author of this account, titles his account, "A True but Brief Account of Our Losses Sustained Since This Cruel and Mischievous War Began." Take as follows. In Narragansett, not one house left standing. At Warwick, but one. At Providence, not above 3. At Patuxet, none left. Very few at Seekonk. At Swansea, 2 at most. Marlborough, wholly laid in ashes, except 2 or 3 houses. Groton and Nashaway, all ruined, but 1 house or 2. Many houses burnt at Springfield, Scituate, Lancaster, Brookfield, and Northampton. The greatest part of Rehoboth and Taunton destroyed. Great spoil made at Hadley, Hatfield, and Chelmsford. Deerfield wholly and Westfield much ruined. At Sudbury, many houses burnt, and some at Hingham, Weymouth, and Braintree. Besides particular farms and plantations, a great number not to be reckoned up, wholly laid waste, or much damnified. And as to persons, it is generally thought that of the English there hath been lost in all, men, women, and children, above 800 since the war began, of whom many have been destroyed with exquisite torments and most inhumane barbarities. The heathen rarely giving quarter to those that they take, but if they were women, they first forced them to satisfy their lusts, and then murdered them, either cutting off their heads, ripping open their bellies, or scalping the head of skin and hair, and hanging them up as trophies, wearing men's fingers as bracelets about their necks, and stripes of their skin which they dress for belts. Nor have our cattle even escaped the cruelty of these worse than brute and savage beasts. For what cattle they took, they seldom killed outright, or if they did, would eat but little of the flesh, but rather cut their bellies, and letting them go several days trailing their guts after them, putting out their eyes, and cutting off 1 leg. Nathaniel Saltonstall's True but Brief Account of Our Losses is a standard portrait of New England during King Philip's War. A landscape of ashes, of farms laid waste, of corpses without heads. A place where 3-legged cattle wander aimlessly, dragging their guts after them, and Indians strut through the woods wearing belts of human skin and necklaces of rotting fingers. It It is difficult to imagine a scene that could do more to assault English notions of order. Towns have been razed and blood spills everywhere. Nearly all that was English in Saltonstall's landscape has been destroyed. English houses, English farms, English crops, English livestock, English bodies. The tamed wilderness has become wild once again. English husbandry and agriculture have been ruined, leaving only scars on a landscape they once marked with fences and barns and fields of hay. Thousands of colonists have suffered, hundreds have died. As one frantic colonist reported, "Many of our miserable inhabitants lie naked, wallowing in their own blood and crying, whilst the barbarous, enraged natives from one part of the country to another are on fire, flaming forth their fury, spoiling cattle and corn and burning houses and torturing men, women, and children and burning them alive." "I am greatly afflicted," Thomas Whaley lamented, "to see the danger we are in and the confusion and sad disorder we have fallen into." And as Saltonstall wrote, nothing could be expected but an utter desolation. Many colonists sheltering themselves in garrisoned houses could do little but watch as their towns were destroyed. While the people of Rehoboth looked on in horror, the Indians fell presently to frying of empty houses and burnt about 35 houses that had families belonging to them, besides 4 other vacant houses that had no inhabitants. "They burnt our mills, broke our stones, yea, even our grinding stones," John Kingsley reported. "And what was hid in the earth they found, corn and fowls, killed cattle and took the hindquarters and left the rest. Yea, all that day they burnt our cart wheels, drove away our cattle, our sheep, our horses." In a word, Kingsley summarized, "Had not the Lord restrained them, they had not left one to tell of our woeful day." Having pitched camp at the edge of town, the Indians rose up at daylight the next morning, walked over to Providence, and there did likewise. "The burial of the slain," Providence's minister wrote, "took us 3 days." Such terrifying ravages strained even the most eloquent colonists' powers of description. Philip Walker called King Philip's War a dreadful bloody shower, and Edward Wharton said the Indians had made of the English settlements a burdensome and menstruous cloth that, having fouled, they might now cast out of the land. Benjamin Thompson believed depicting this cruelest of wars required more than bloody metaphors, more even than the formidable skills of a poet. Since words alone could not suffice, Thompson wished a painter might overtrack his pen. Of the Indians, Thompson urged, "Limn them besmeared with Christian blood and oiled with the fat out of white human bodies boiled. Draw them with clubs like mauls and full of stains, like Vulcans anviling New England's brains. Of the damage, paint here the house and there the barn on fire, with holocausts ascending in a spire. Of loss, draw there the pastor for his Bible crying, the soldier for his sword, the glutton frying. And of torment, let here the mother seem a statue turned, at the sad object of her bowels burned." Thompson, with the help of his painter, presented a strikingly gruesome panorama, but Mary Rowlandson of Lancaster, unaided, provided perhaps the most arresting image of all. "Thus were we butchered by the merciless heathen," she recalled, "standing amazed, with the blood running down to our heels." Not only the colonists, but their land too was bleeding, as Edward Wharton put it, like a burdensome and menstruous cloth. What happened to English people during King Philip's War, in the colonists' eyes, happened equally to English property, and the separation of the one from another, of people from their property, was counted among the greatest devastations of the war. "Draw confusion everywhere," Benjamin Thompson had instructed his artist, "and paint the goddess of disorder ruling over all of New England. Let Ataxy be mounted on a throne, imposing her commands on everyone. One she bids flee, another stay. A third she bids betake him to his rusty sword. This to his treasure, the other to his knees. Some counsels she to fry, and some to freeze. These to the garrison, those to the road. Some to run empty, some to take their load. Thus while confusion most men's hearts divide, fire doth their small exchequer soon decide." 1 in 10 colonists died in New England during King Philip's War, but many more lost everything that they owned. What was hardest to bear about these losses of houses, cows, fences, barns, was that they weren't just things. They were everything. When the English had first arrived in New England, they had measured their differentness from the Indians, from their local neighbors, in the clothes that they wore, in the livestock they kept, in the houses they built, in the churches in which they worshipped. They had said through these material differences, "We are civilized, you are savage. It is because we have these things, these clothes, these homes, that we know and we are always reminded that you are naked nomads and we are clothed, sedentary, farmers, civilized people. Every thatched roof, in other words, rested on a foundation of property rights, and every cupboard housed a universe of ideas. When all of these things, these houses, cows, fences, and barns, were destroyed during the war, the way Nathaniel Saltonstall describes them, the colonists felt that they had been left as naked and as savage as Indians themselves. At the same time, the English found that over the course of the war, they had come to fight just as savagely as their enemies, whom they had called savage to begin with. In sum, colonists in New England during King Philip's War worried that the war was turning them into Indians, that in losing their homes, becoming nomads, living in a world of disorder, and also in fighting against a savage enemy but fighting savagely, the Puritan mission to a city on a hill was being utterly destroyed. Everywhere, it seemed to the colonists, there were barbarians at the gate. Appalled by their astounding losses during the war, many colonists in New England believed that God was punishing them for their sins, not least among them their failure to convert the Indians to Christianity. "Betwixt God and us," John Eliot confided to the governor of Massachusetts, "I think that our sins have ripened us for so severe a scourge as this war hath, and is likely to prove." War, the Puritan minister Increase Mather maintained, is the greatest of all outward judgments. Or as John Kingsley put it, general sin usually calls for general plague, which is now. The English had always looked for supernatural messages in the natural world, in the skies, in monstrous births, in diseases, in bad crops. During the war, they strained their eyes to see messages within the devastation around them. As Mary Pray wrote from Providence, "We know not what to do, but our eyes are upward." Everywhere the English found God writing his judgment onto New England's landscape, or onto English bodies. He had made New England into a looking glass, whose ravages reflected the colonists' own spiritual corruption. He had filled the colonists' cup of sorrow. He had made his hand heavy upon the land. He had taken away the churches of those who were unfaithful, the houses of those who were greedy, the clothes of those who were proud, and the lives of those who sinned. Most terrifying of all, the colonists inevitably came to the conclusion that God may indeed have abandoned his once chosen people. Ironically, for all the effort that the colonists spent in looking upward, looking at the devastation around them and trying to see within it a message from God, they utterly failed to interpret the devastation around them as a message from their very near neighbors. That somehow this devastation might be a way in which the Indians were communicating to them a very specific set of grievances. In fact, what the Puritans always do in their accounts of the war is wonder time and again, how could these Indians have decided to wage war on us? We have never provoked them. There is no possible just cause behind their engaging in war against us. There's a tremendous amount of misery around a failure to understand what possibly could have prompted the war. But indeed, what I found in looking at the records from the war itself is that there were many ways in which Indians were quite explicitly communicating, it would seem quite effectively, what their real motives were in waging war against the English during King Philip's War. After decades of learning about the colonists' religion, visiting their churches, holding their Bibles, meeting their ministers, Algonquins in New England were well prepared to attack the colonists' spiritual Achilles' heel, their very fear that God had forsaken them, and attack it they did. As Edward Wharton reported, "The Indians, I hear, insult very much and tell the English warriors that God is against them and for the Indians, and that the English shall, for their unrighteousness, fall into their hands." At Sudbury, one Nipmuc taunted an old man, saying, "Come, Lord Jesus, save this poor Englishman if thou canst, whom I am now about to kill." When the Nipmucs returned from a fight, they typically celebrated by mocking their victims, scoffing that they had done them a good turn to send them to heaven so soon. In Groton, Indians destroyed the town's church and then asked the minister, "What will you do now for a house to pray in, now that we have burnt your meeting house?" While under siege in Brookfield, an English captain tried to encourage his soldiers by declaring, "God is with us and fights for us and will deliver us out of the hands of these heathen." To which the Nipmucs, who had heard this rallying cry, responded by sending in many shots and shouting, "Now see how your God delivers us." To provoke the English into leaving their garrisoned house, a group of Nipmucs went into the church next door and in contempt made an hideous noise somewhat resembling singing, mocking the colonists' own psalm singing in an attempt to get them to leave their garrisoned house. Laughing at the Puritan solemn practices of piety, the Nipmucs called out to the besieged colonists, "Come and pray and sing psalms with us." But the people of Brookfield in this instance restrained themselves, begging the Lord to give them courage to resist the temptation. Algonquin attacks on Christianity could be symbolic as well as verbal. When Goodman Wright, who had a strange confidence or rather conceit that whilst he held his Bible in his hand, he looked upon himself as secure from all kinds of violence, the Indians who killed him, deriding his groundless apprehension or folly, ripped him open and put his Bible in his belly. Retreating Indians might also leave particular objects behind, objects that could be made to operate as powerful symbols: books, goats, hoes, cows, clogs, aprons, church bells. When used by Indians to leave a trail of signs, even these everyday objects, like a hat shot through found in the road, could become terrifying. In June of 1675, for example, English soldiers were tracking the enemy in Rhode Island when, after they had marched about a mile and a half, they passed by some houses newly burned. Not far off from one of them, they found a Bible, newly torn, and the leaves scattered about by the enemy in hatred of our religion. But this was just the beginning of the trail. 2 or 3 miles further, they came up with some heads, scalps, and hands cut off from the bodies of the English and stuck upon poles near the highway, as the colonists put it, in that barbarous and inhumane manner, bidding us defiance. First the houses, then the pages of the Bible, and then the body parts themselves. Scenes like this seem to carry the Indians' message within them. We will first take away your shelter, then your beliefs, and only then will we take your lives, leaving you not as men, but as bare butchered flesh. As one colonist aptly put it, our enemies proudly exalt over us and blaspheme the name of our blessed God, saying, "Where is your God?" So within these actions, I think we can very clearly see that the Indians were interested in attacking Christianity. The English had indeed been attempting to convert many Algonquin Indians to Christianity before the war, and Philip was himself was decidedly hostile to these efforts of conversion. He felt that they were taking Indians out of his sovereignty, and he was losing control over them. They were losing their Indianness and converting to Christianity. And within the war, these attacks on Christianity by Indians, I think, are a very clear message. Just as Indians attacked Christianity, they also attacked English agriculture, knowing as they did that English farms and cows and sheep were what gave the English their claim to their land, and that these very farms and cows and sheep were at the heart of the Indians' own loss of land and were interfering with Algonquin subsistence practices. "We have nothing but our lives to lose, but thou hast many fair houses, cattle, and much good things," one Nipmuc wrote in a note tacked to a tree outside Medford as it burned to the ground. "You know and we know," another Nipmuc warned in a letter negotiating the release of captives. "You have great sorrowful with crying, for you lost many, many hundred men, and all your houses, and all your land, and women, and children, and cattle, and all your things you have lost." Not only notes, but rites of cruelty and the verbal taunts that accompanied them also attacked the English attachment to land. While burying several English captives alive, a group of Algonquins mocked English agriculture. They buried these men up to their necks in the ground so that only their heads were sitting up above the ground. And then they taunted them and said, "You English, since you come into this country, have grown exceedingly above the ground, have grown many plants above the ground. Let us now see how you will grow when planted into the ground." Again, what would seem to be a fairly clear attempt to communicate a very specific grievance against English agricultural practices. The waging of the war, then, left English colonists anxious on all counts. Not only had they lost so much, so many lives and so much property, but they were anxious that their God had forsaken them, and this is an anxiety that the Indians capitalized on. They were anxious that they themselves had become savage in the tortures that they inflicted on Indians that they had captured. And they were anxious that the Indians would destroy everything in New England that had made order out of a land that upon their arrival the Puritans had considered to be a chaos. The way the English dealt with this tremendous anxiety that the waging of King Philip War caused was to write about it, and write about it some more. For only by writing about the war, what we might cynically call putting a spin on the war, could the English reconcile themselves to what had been done to them and to what they themselves had done to the Indians. However remarkable for the magnitude of its destruction or the depths of its cruelties, King Philip's War is almost as remarkable for how much the colonists wrote about it. Over 400 letters written during the war survive in New England archives alone, and along with more than 30 editions of 20 different printed accounts, many of them here at the American Antiquarian Society. In letters, diaries, and chronicles, English men and women in New England expressed their agonies, mourned their losses, and most of all, defended their conduct. Not all colonists agreed about the causes of the war or about how it should be waged, but most agreed about what was at stake: their lives, their land, and their sense of themselves. And in the end, their writing about King Philip War proved to be pivotal to their victory, a victory that would draw new, firmer boundaries between English and Indian people in New England, between English and Indian land, and between what it meant to be English and what it meant to be Indian. I'm trying to turn it on and I'm not getting anywhere. Okay. It's been moved, I think. I have a few slides here to show from this point on, and I want to talk about the accounts that the colonists wrote trying to come to terms with King Philip's War. The very earliest of these accounts were news reports. This is an account, you can't see the text on here unfortunately, that appeared in the London Gazette just 3 months after the war broke out. Pretty fast breaking news to get all the way across the Atlantic in the 17th century that fast. The lead story here in this London Gazette for August of 1675 is an account of the devastation in the first summer of King Philip's War. So the earliest accounts that the colonists wrote that we have available to us really are news accounts. Letters written from one person in one part of New England to another part, from friends and relatives to relatives in London. And those letters to people in London were often published, some in the London Gazette, some in pamphlet literature. They tended to be interested in participating in a literature in London that was a somewhat prurient literature of catastrophe, not unlike the tabloid journalism we think of today. So they always emphasized the devastation of the war and the cruelties of the war. But they certainly also addressed the fact that people in England were quite concerned about what was going on in King Philip's War. Lots of people had friends and relatives, and it was a quite serious, obviously, conflict. Increase Mather would later write, "The report of poor New England's calamity has caused those that are in lands afar off to be amazed and troubled." By 1676, accounts had been printed not just in London, but also in Boston and in Cambridge in Massachusetts. Let's see if I can do this. Among them, the Puritan minister Increase Mather's own history of the war. Mather published several sermons that he gave over the course of the war as well. But his brief history of the war, published in Boston and then also in London at the same time, is one of the more famous printed versions of stories of the war. These later accounts are not news reports. They tend to be more somber reflections in which people like Puritan ministers try to grapple more specifically with the moral consequences of engaging in what was considered to be by many an unjust war, or at very least a war that was fought beyond the normal restraints of warfare. In effect, the first year of the war brought with it a tremendous outpouring of print. At least 20 different editions of printed narratives appeared in London, Boston, or Cambridge. Many appeared in more than one edition. They were so popular that they went into multiple editions, for a total of no less than 30 separate printings. Even in an era which is, of course, profoundly less print-oriented than our own, in which books are quite rare, the ability to read them is extremely rare. Many, many books about King Philip's War were printed and were read and were vastly popular, including the best-known narrative of King Philip's War, Mary Rowlandson's dramatic captivity narrative. Rowlandson, of course, was the wife of the minister of the town of Lancaster, taken captive by Nipmunks for 3 months. Wrote an account of her captivity, which later was published in 1682, went through 4 editions, and was America's first bestseller. Even if you estimate very moderate print runs, there were at least 20,000 copies of books about King Philip's War circulating in the Anglo-American book market during and immediately after the war. In these writings, these early writings about King Philip's War, Philip is not necessarily central. Really, the devastation of the war is the central actor in these stories. But to the extent that Philip is portrayed, he's portrayed as a villainous, treacherous monster, a blasphemous villain, the worst kind of possible savage. And these counts were likely to spend considerable time celebrating Philip's very violent death in August of 1676 when he was shot, drawn and quartered, and his head was staked on a pole and brought to Plymouth. And it happened to be that on the day that Philip's head arrived in Plymouth, people of Plymouth were celebrating a day of Thanksgiving for recent victories in the war. The irony of which was not lost on the Puritans themselves. Philip's father, Massasoit, is the Wampanoag sachem who we know from the story of the first Thanksgiving in 1621, who sat down to feast with the Indians. In 1676, Philip's Massasoit's son arrives at a Thanksgiving feast. His decapitated head arrives, and the Puritan minister Increase Mather, the author of this account we're looking at now, declared that Philip's head was a welcome sight and would be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness on this their festive day of Thanksgiving. Memories of the war remained fresh in the colonists' minds for decades. Increase Mather's son Cotton, decades later, traveled to Plymouth, where Philip's head, his skull now, continued to remain staked on a pole in the town of Plymouth for public viewing. And Mather climbed up to the top of the pole and pulled Philip's jawbone off of the skull. And I think it's a significant action because it shows just how powerfully the colonists felt about King Philip's War, even a generation later. But it suggests just how powerfully Cotton Mather, like Increase Mather before him, was interested in silencing Philip, in literally taking away his mouth, even after his death, taking away his jawbone, silencing all kinds of possibilities for Indian versions of the story of King Philip's War. Those taunts, those attacks on Puritan Christianity, those attacks on English agricultural practice, those needed to be silenced even in Cotton Mather's generation, that a possible different kind of story of the war could be told. During the war, Daniel Gookin, who was superintendent of the Indians over the course of the war, read through these many abundant narratives the Puritans had written trying to come to terms with the war. And Gookin noticed something curious. He noticed that there were no accounts of the war about the Christian Indians, the Indians who had been converted to Christianity and had been absorbed into the Puritan community on the eve of the war. Gookin decided that it was an unfair portrayal of the war to not pay attention to the Christian Indian story about the war. And he wrote an account, a historical account of the doings and sufferings of the Christian Indians in New England, presented it for publication, and it was denied publication. It was not actually published until 1836, when it was published by the American Antiquarian Society in their collections in 1836. But I tell this story to suggest to you that, like Cotton Mather's pulling of Philip's jawbone off of the skull, the failure of Daniel Gookin to publish an account of King Philip's War that was sympathetic to any Indians, in this case Christian Indians, suggests just how powerfully the Puritans were interested in telling their own side of the story about the war. In effect, the English in New England were more interested in doing what is done on this, what has happened to this slide? I'm trying. Maybe someone hit the table back there. Okay. This should be familiar to you as an early version. What did I do? As an early version of the Massachusetts colony seal, which was adopted in 1639. And the portrait, which we'll be able to see imminently, no doubt, is of an Indian with open arms welcoming the English peacefully. And the words coming out of his mouth in this cartoon bubble read, "Come over and help us." And this was the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony at its founding. And the expectation that the colonists had was that they would be greeted by a welcoming group of Indians who were eager to be converted to Christianity, who were eager to be helped. But the reason I show the seal is to suggest that the expectation of the English war was that the Indians did not have a voice of their own, that you could quite literally put words in their mouth, put this bubble coming out of their mouth, that, as we can see on the basis of the attacks on Christianity during King Philip's War, is quite antithetical to what Indians might have said, might have wanted to tell the English when they first arrived, or certainly wanted to tell them in 1676. This is a critical point about the stories of King Philip's War, because the absence of written narratives by Indians, even when there were in fact a large number of Indians who could read and write in 17th century New England, is curious. And I think it reflects upon a difference that a 17th century English writer, Samuel Purchas, called the literal advantage. Want of letters, Purchas argued, left Indians in awe of Europeans' astounding abilities to read and write, and led them to think the letter itself could speak. Compared to men who could read and write, Indians were no more than speaking apes, Purchas believed. For Purchas and for many Europeans and English colonists, the literal advantage separated men from beasts. Amongst men, Purchas wrote, some are accounted civil and both more sociable and religious by the use of letters and writing, which others wanting are esteemed brutish, savage, and barbarous. So for the English, the dividing line between savagery and civilization was about having houses and clothes, but it was also about having the ability to read and write. And I think that the literal advantage is kind of well conveyed in a pair of contrasting portraits I want to show to you. This is the Puritan minister Increase Mather, the author of the Brief History, the title page of which I showed you a few minutes ago. And in this portrait of Mather, he's shown in his study, in front of a wall of books that are now in this building, many of them, holding his books in front of him. He's clearly a man who is mired in his own literacy. Even the collar of his cloak looks like the open pages of a book. Mather is shown here clothed in the arts of civilization and of culture and of letters. And if you contrast this portrait to a contemporary portrait of Ninigret, a Narragansett sachem, Ninigret is shown not inside of a building, not clothed, certainly not with books, but out in the wilderness, completely naked, more naked than a native Algonquin costume would have allowed in this time. And Ninigret is really shown in the wild, and the emphasis here is between literacy, clothing people with civilization in a way. The colonists wrote about literacy as a kind of cloaking, as a step towards becoming civilized and towards becoming clothed in that respect. So what I think this literal advantage suggests to us about King Philip's War is that it is really the greatest irony of the war. That wars are waged not just with guns and knives, but with pens and printing presses. And these pens and printing presses are the tools that the Algonquins really didn't have access to, the tools that they most profoundly lacked. So if wars are won not just on the battlefield, but in the writing and the accounts about the war themselves, on the battlefield the Algonquins clearly lost, but their more important loss was the loss of not being able to tell their story about the war. This literal advantage, of course, allowed the English colonists to reconcile themselves with King Philip's War, to make sense of their losses, to explain their own savagery in terms that they could understand without fear of contradiction. In writing about King Philip's War, the Puritans tried to restore their city on a hill, but in generations to come, the Puritan version of King Philip's War would be updated, challenged, and ultimately reversed. Even a literal advantage can slip away over time. And now I want to talk a little bit about how King Philip's War has been remembered by subsequent generations of Americans. The story of King Philip's War lay somewhat dormant until the era of the American Revolution, when Americans, especially New Englanders, became newly fascinated with the history of King Philip's War. And all sorts of these original Puritan narratives were suddenly reprinted, like this 1773 version of Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, printed throughout New England, printed in other parts of the colonies. And when these Puritan narratives of King Philip's War were printed in the era of the American Revolution, they were always updated with a new preface in which the Puritan ancestors were seen as brave fighters for their freedom against Indians, and now New Englanders must repeat that model of bravery and courage and use that courage to fight against the British, whom, as these prefaces always declared, were simply more distant savages than the Indians had been in the 17th century. So in the era of the American Revolution, King Philip's War is remembered, and it is remembered in a spirit in which the Puritans would have been pleased, in which the Puritan view of the war is celebrated, and Puritan courage in the war is rewarded. I'll show you a few more slides from this. I know this is another slide of a somewhat damaged reprinting from the 1770s of Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, in which Rowlandson here clearly looks like a revolutionary patriot. She's got her tri-cornered hat and her gun. Similarly, in the previous slide, you can see Rowlandson is fighting men who actually look a bit more like British soldiers than they do like Indians. So in the Revolutionary era, these Puritan stories are updated. a spin is put on them that makes them useful propaganda during the American Revolution. The most famous reprint, the most famous product of King Philip's War from the era of the American Revolution is this portrait engraving of Philip done by Paul Revere. Philip is long dead. It has bears no relation to Philip's actual appearance, but it became a powerful and important image of King Philip in years to come, and a lasting legacy of how Americans would envision Philip in years to come. During the American Revolution, then, when Philip had been dead for more than a century, now the story of his war was put to a new end. With an uncanny sense of political expediency, New Englanders of the Revolutionary generation resurrected the story of King Philip's War in order to employ it as a propaganda tool against the British. In depicting the British as more savage enemies than the Indians of King Philip's War, these revolutionaries hit on a powerful source of revolutionary rhetoric, and this was what Revere himself was tapping into when he decided to engrave a portrait of Philip as an illustration for a new, updated reprinting of one of the 17th century narratives of King Philip's War. Just as King Philip's War took on a new meaning during the American Revolution, it took on a new meaning another generation later, in the 1830s, when the story of the war would be curiously reversed. This is a portrait of the famous 19th century actor Edwin Forrest, perhaps the most famous American actor of the 19th century, in full costume as Metamora, or Philip. In the 19th century, beginning in 1829, Edwin Forrest played King Philip in the most popular play of the 19th century. And you can see that Forrest's costuming is quite heavily borrowed from Revere's portrait here. This is a photograph of Forrest by Matthew Brady that was done later in the century. Beginning in 1829, Edwin Forrest played King Philip in theaters across the United States, calling him Metamora, a kind of play on his Indian name Metacom. And there are towns in Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois called Metamora. Metamora was fantastically popular, and Forrest made buckets of money off of this play. In Metamora, whose subtitle was Last of the Wampanoags, Forrest portrayed Philip as a uniquely American hero. By the 1830s, the story of King Philip's War had been reversed. It was still used as a tale of patriotism, but now, in the 1830s, Philip was the patriot. Philip was the metaphor for the revolution. The story came to be seen as one in which Americans could venerate and celebrate this ancient Indian ancestor who had fought to free his people from foreign tyranny, the foreign tyranny of people like Increase Mather and other English colonists. And in a way, Americans in this post-revolutionary age turned the story of King Philip's War to their own ends, reversing its plot lines, totally reversing the Puritan version of the story. And Forrest was at the heart of that. Metamora became a distinctly American hero, a way for Americans in a new nation searching for ancestors, no longer wanting to look back to English ancestors because they now despised England, having fought a war of revolution against them, searching instead for Indian ancestors, romanticizing Indians as noble savages, and declaring Philip's cause completely just. I cannot underestimate how popular Metamora was. In the 19th century, a series of novels about King Philip's War were published, other plays were written and published, other poems were written, all sorts of new paintings and portraits and engravings were sold of Philip. This is a history of King Philip's War from 1844, in which Philip is now called Metamora. Even though that's a fictional name, he takes it on. A dime novel from later in the century, a cheap novel about the story of the war, in which Philip, again, is depicted as a noble savage, but a hero of revolutionary, patriotic proportions. This is from 1852, a nursery rhyme about King Philip, which embraces him as a hero, even as it mourns the loss of life in King Philip's War. And that's sort of where I want to end with that. So in the 19th century, what you see is this reversal in which Americans decide to take on King Philip as a hero, to take him on as a uniquely American ancestor. And the irony, of course, is that what the Puritan writing about King Philip's War in the first place had done was attempt to justify the Puritans' war against Philip and the Wampanoags. Their justifications become completely undone in the 19th century as Americans put the story of the war to a particular use. And today there are, I don't think you can see this slide very well. Today there are stories of King Philip's War that are still told. This is a slide of the King Philip Inn in Bristol, Rhode Island, which I think suggests the theme that is more prevalent today in New England about King Philip's War, which is simply the ways in which we have lots of parts of New England that are named after King Philip. King Philip Schools, King Philip Street. And King Philip is not very well remembered, but has a kind of iconic presence. He's sort of a fetishized presence in our lives today. At the same time, though, even as the King Philip's War is not as popular today as it was in the 19th century, it is still very passionately protested by many New England Native American peoples who are very interested in further undoing the Puritan story of King Philip's War and telling that story in a different way, and in a way that heroizes Philip like as he was heroized in the 19th century. But I think the story of King Philip's War, from how the war was waged, to how the war was written about, to how it has been remembered over the last centuries, is a story about American identity, and how American identity is founded on a clash of cultures. That American identity rests on a legacy both of cultural exchange and cultural borrowing, and on a legacy of conquest. King Philip's War also shows us that all wars are just as much a contest for meaning and for memory as they are for territory. And it shows us that the East, or at the very least New England, was won not by the sword, but by the pen as well, since that literal advantage that the Puritans had in the first place was what ensured their victory for that first century of its legacy. In 1676, Puritans in New England understood King Philip's War as a rebuke from God, considered Philip a savage villain, and utterly ignored Indian explanations for the war. A century later, American revolutionaries told the story of King Philip's War to rouse anti-British sentiment. In the 1830s, Americans across the country flocked to theaters to see Edwin Forrest play Metamora on stage and to worship him as an all-American ancestor. Today, the story of the war is celebrated and protested and rewritten by Native American peoples in New England who are seeking to hold on to their own Indian identity. All of these tellings and retellings and resurrections shape who we are today. Sitting in a room not far from where well-heeled Worcester men once offered a toast to Philip, pledging to admire him, but also declaring that if they'd had the chance, they would have happily slain him. We are reminded that we are a people with a complicated ancestry. Thank you.
Jill has offered to take a few questions from the audience, and she will restate your question and maybe cut it down to size if it gets too long. Does anyone have any that they want to pose to her? Yes?
We know about this devastating terrible war 300 years ago. How did it stack up population-wise in numbers for the Indians as opposed to the English settlers? Were they fairly well balanced, or were at that time more settlers in Massachusetts than Indians? Okay,
the question was how can we compare the losses of to population of Indians versus the losses to colonists, as also compared to their initial population on the eve of the war? So, okay. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about Indian population in New England on the eve of the war, and we know even less in terms of actual numbers about their losses, partly because the colonists weren't very eager to keep close track of such matters, and partly because they weren't actually able to keep very close track of matters. The colonists lost 1 in 10 colonists, so a literal decimation of the population. I think Indian losses were far, far greater, partly because at the end of the war, most Algonquin men who had fought against the English were sold into slavery and shipped to the West Indies, and most of them would have died during the passage, or would have died very quickly soon after arrival. And during the war, the Indians suffered a great number of losses to starvation and exposure, like the Christian Indians who were sent to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. simply didn't have the means to take care of themselves. So I think that there were numbers of different ways that Indians were vulnerable during the war, no matter where they were during the war. And colonists had more opportunity to protect themselves and simply to retreat towards the coast. And they weren't as likely to die from starvation. So I certainly think that Indian losses were greater. I can't give you actual numbers of their losses because they're simply not really recoverable at this point.
Yeah, back in Thanksgiving last year, I thought the English settlement in Plymouth gave the Wampanoags a hard time saying they were uncivilized in the sense of breaking the civil code of the town. I think they even tried to put them in jail for a day or two because they were protesting the Thanksgiving feast. So they're giving them the same treatment they gave them the other year.
The question was about the protest in Plymouth last Thanksgiving. You may remember it from local news coverage. It has been a tradition for at least 10 years that a group of Native Americans on Thanksgiving Day, when the town of Plymouth holds a parade called Pilgrim's Progress, to stage a protest of that parade. And quite explicitly, the protest was always staged in the name of King Philip. And on one occasion, that group attempted to bury Plymouth Rock. And this past fall, the Plymouth police said attempted to interfere with the process, with the smooth progress of the parade, and a number of the activists were arrested, and numbers of their non-Native American activists were arrested as well. So yeah, there are this contest between what meaning we put on our colonial past is one that is with us today, and one that can, in some instances, come actually to violence.
How much help did they get here from the other, say the Germans or the Dutch? You speak just about the English fighting this war. Did the other colonists offer to help? And how much did the Indians help the English here, the Indians that, that were on their side?
Okay. The question was, what kind of alliances aided the English in the cause of the war? The English feared above all that the Dutch were actually supplying Philip's side with guns, and there's some possibility that they were doing that. There's some evidence to support that. They didn't have other European, non-English European support. They had a lot of anger coming to them from England, because a lot of people in England were suspicious that the Puritans had provoked this war as just a simple means to take new lands. So they didn't actually have a lot of help from other Europeans. They did have a fair amount of help from other Indian groups. The Pequots and Mohegans did serve at some point in the war alongside the English, although there were some questions about how loyal they really were to the English, how carefully they aimed when they were firing. And the Christian Indians who had converted to Christianity and considered themselves loyal to the English were sometimes taken off Deer Island and made available for service during the war. Sadly, then at the end of the war, even though they had been promised their freedom, some of them were indiscriminately rounded up and sent off into slavery, even though they had served alongside. Because at the end of the war, the English sort of threw up their hands and said, we're not going to discriminate. We cannot tell the difference between a good Indian and a bad Indian. And this very racialized notion that there's no possibility of there being a good Indian led to a kind of failure to protect Indian allies at the end of the war.
Do you see a parallel between the Christian Indians imprisoned on Deer Island and the Japanese evacuated on the West Coast in World War II? The Japanese from fear. Were the Christian Indians imprisoned because of fear or because of demonizing?
The question was whether there's a parallel that we could usefully draw between the confinement of the Nisei in World War II, the Japanese Americans who were confined in the west coast of this country during the war, and the confinement of Christian Indians during King Philip's War. Sure, there's an obvious parallel there in the sense that the idea that the Puritans had, they didn't think that it was possible to be an Indian who was loyal to England, in the same way that the American government did not believe it was possible to be a Japanese American and be loyal to the United States. There's a failure to believe that that's a possibility, and an expectation that these people are traitors within our midst, and that's why the Indians were indeed confined.
One of their ancestors all of a sudden took a transition between being an enemy to being like a national hero through a form of entertainment.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, something I didn't really get to talk about here today. It's something I talk about at some length in the book. The question was, how did Indian peoples in the 19th century respond to this really pretty bizarre transformation of Philip from this horrible villain in 1770 to this great all-American hero in the 1830s? They responded in a very savvy way. What in New England, what two groups in particular, the Penobscots and the Mashpees, did was take advantage of New Englanders' newfound veneration of Philip and use it to their own political ends. So they would do things like attend performances of this play. And there's this great instance when Penobscots come to town, and one day they attend a performance of Metamora, and they're also at the same time in town lobbying for claims to their own, retaining their own land before the State House. And the Mashpee Wampanoags submit petitions to the state of Massachusetts declaring that they have the right to govern themselves, partly on the basis of the kind of sentiment, the embrace of the noble savage that the play Metamora represents. And they also take the opportunity to remind New Englanders that they themselves and their own ancestors served on the patriot side in the American Revolution, that you don't need to go back as far as the 17th century to find an Indian patriot. You can find Penobscots who fought in the Revolution. So in just the kind of subtle, sophisticated political way that revolutionaries used the story of King Philip's War in the 1770s as a propaganda tool, Native American groups in the 1830s used the romanticization of Philip as a way to try to advance their own political causes.
When Indians fought Indians, were the results just as bloody as in King Philip's War?
The question is, when Indians fought Indians, were the results just as bloody as in King Philip's War? Well, that's harder to measure because who's recording it, for one thing. You assume then that you have a colonist who's there, and then you have, the sort of corruption of the evidence question, because is there a way in which the war is being fought differently because the English are at some level involved enough to be there? So it would be a hard question to answer. A lot of people at the time thought that the Indians were fighting beyond what their traditional restraints were on warfare during King Philip's War, that in previous conflicts with other Indians and with the colonists, that they had in fact restrained themselves to wars that were not intended to be as fatal as the kind of all-out war that King Philip's War became. So my guess would be that those Indian-on-Indian conflicts, especially before King Philip's War, were probably less merciless. Let me get someone in the back there.
That swing you mentioned in the attitude of the 1830s, that certainly swung back, though, in the next 40 years after that, would you say, or not?
The sermon?
No, the swinging attitude about Philip.
Okay, yeah.
I've read several histories of my town, Lancaster, where they're very critical of Philip by the late...
The question is, did this heroization of Philip in the 1830s, did that become a permanent part of American life? No, it didn't. It swung back. By the end of the 19th century, by the 1880s, well, one indication is the play Metamora is restaged in 1877, the 200th anniversary of the end of King Philip's War, and it's a complete flop. No one will go to it, and all the reviews say, how did anyone ever go to this horrible play where people would sit around and applaud King Philip, this bloody barbarian who's killing people just like people are being killed out west in the Plains Wars today? It's the Plains warfare and the violence of Plains warfare in the latter half of the 19th century that makes the romanticization of people like Philip impossible. Americans, white Americans, suddenly say, well, that we cannot actually worship Indians as our own ancestors anymore. We have this new reality of conflict before us.
Was he killed by the English or by his own people?
The question was Philip killed by the English or by his own people? He was killed by a party of English soldiers, but the actual person who shot him dead was an Indian scout.
I've read several books about the King Philip War, and many of them indicate that King Philip was actually the king of the Wampanoags, who the conflict began with the Wampanoags and the English. But after that, the conflict spread throughout the Indians of southern New England, and King Philip really wasn't the leader. He wasn't there at most of the conflicts, and he wasn't the tactician behind the moves. I'd like you to address that.
Okay. The comment was from someone who had read numerous histories of King Philip's War that, in fact, Philip was not a leader of a confederation who had a particular kind of political and military authority or tactical responsibility, that in fact other Indians joined the conflict for their own reasons and fought to achieve their own particular goals. And I think that is true, is pretty much supported by the evidence. Philip only becomes the central character of the war later on, when the war is retold as this romantic tale of this patriot struggling to free his people from foreign tyranny. And then he becomes much more central to the story of the war. But it is true that the colonists at the time did fixate fixate on Philip as the enemy they most wanted to get. That in their mind, when Philip was dead, the war would be over. I mean, he was a significant symbolic leader for many different Indian groups, if only that his defeat, because he was one of the last holdouts by the end of the war, meant a kind of defeat of whatever different causes people came to with. But it's certainly true that in the 19th century, Philip's military role was greatly exaggerated by historians who were interested in heroizing him. Yeah.
How many English settlers were in New England? Were 1,000 or 5,000?
Several tens of thousands. I'm not sure exactly what the size of the population was. Between 1630 and 1640 alone, at least 20,000 migrants came. So by the 1670s, there's not a lot more new migrants, but there's those 20,000 settlers, plus others who've come, plus their descendants, and a whole new generation. So several tens of thousands.
Is there any truth to the legend that there's a rock in Bristol that's supposed to be his throne?
Yeah, there is. Has anyone been to the rock in Bristol that's called King Philip's Seat? Yeah, a few people have. There is, in Bristol, Rhode Island, on the site of the Hafen-Reffer Museum of Anthropology, which is a Brown University museum, there is a rock formation that I've climbed up with my dog that sort of looks like a bit of a seat you can climb up and sort of kind of wedge yourself into it. And the myth is that Philip sat at this site and addressed his counselors and prepared them for war. Whether or not he actually did is not necessarily is not really necessarily documentable, but certainly that was his headquarters or his homeland at the time of the war.
Yeah. You mentioned a book that was denied publication about the Christian Indians. Is that something that was salvaged by you, perhaps?
No, the question was about the book that I mentioned in the course of my lecture, the book that was written in 1677 about the Christian Indian experience and what actually happened to it. Daniel Gookin sent it to London, to the Society for the Preservation of the Gospel in New England, with the intent of their publishing it, and they simply put it aside. And it was a copy of it was later discovered, not by me, and it was printed by the American Antiquarian Society in 1836, when they were publishing lots of material about Indians, partly because the 1830s is when Indians are really romanticized. There's a lot of interest in Indians, and things like Daniel Gookin's account of the Christian Indians' experience in the war are real novelty items, are very exciting. People are interested in accumulating documents about Indian experience for that reason. So it resurfaces then, and we're lucky to have it. It has lots of information that doesn't exist elsewhere. The kind of documents that I found that haven't been seen before, haven't been thought about before, that I use as my evidence for Indian perspective, there are lots of documents in the Massachusetts State Archives that are petitions written by Christian Indians. For instance, a man writes in and says, "You have my sister in jail, you're going to sell her to Barbados, and she's my sister. And I served as a spy for you during the war. Please, please, please don't sell her into slavery." And so there are these really interesting petitions that exist that other historians haven't actually really looked at. So there are some materials I've unearthed that haven't been seen before, and are really exciting finds, I think.
As a result of your research, what's your objective opinion as to the real causes of King Philip's War?
The question was, what's my opinion on the basis of my research of the real causes behind King Philip's War? Land, 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 and more land was really the basic cause. The question of territory, there was just a finite amount of territory that both peoples wanted. But I think at heart there was also a conflict over just the clash of cultures. I believe that by the eve of the war, the English were really worried that they had become quite Indianized, and the Indians were really worried that they had been contaminated by the English. The Indians worried that too many of them had become Christian, too many of them were speaking English, wearing English clothes, some were even living in English houses, and Philip complains about this when he meets with negotiators on the eve of the war. Meanwhile, the Puritans are giving sermons left and right saying, "We've all become too Indianized, this is a disaster, we're losing our Puritanness, we're losing our Englishness." I think the blurring of the two cultures led both sides to just be anxious about living alongside one another and felt the need to push apart. And I think that happens again and again in American history.
Well, I know you will all want to join me in thanking Jill for a wonderful talk and also congratulating her on the publication of this very interesting and exciting book that tells us so much about what happened 300 years ago and what it means to us today in New England. are just coming into bookstores now, and if your local bookstore doesn't have it, don't hesitate to ask them to order it. We do have a few copies left for sale, and we are taking the orders up here, the sales up here. There are very few copies left, but Jill will be happy to autograph. Good evening. I'm Ellen Dunlap, President of the American Antiquarian Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before I introduce Jill Lepore to speak about her new book on King Philip's War, let me say a few words about the circumstances that bring this audience and this speaker together here in this place. For our C-SPAN viewers, a geography lesson may be helpful. We are gathered in Worcester, Massachusetts, the second largest city in New England, situated some 40 miles west of Boston. Most of the incidents of the bloody conflict of 1675 and 1676, about which we will hear, took place in towns and villages which lie within 50 miles of this very spot. King Philip's War is local history in these parts. For some of us, it is also family history, as those who fought and died included our ancestors, Algonquin and English. The events of more than 300 years ago are thus of continuing personal interest to many here tonight. The room in which we have assembled is, by day, the busy library reading room of the American Antiquarian Society. We were founded in 1812 as the first national historical organization in the country, and we continue to this day to actively and comprehensively collect, organize, preserve, and make available for use books, newspapers, manuscripts, and graphic images from throughout the nation, which document American history and culture through the year 1876. The oft-asked question, why Worcester and not Boston, Philadelphia, or New York for a national institution, is easy to answer. In 1812, Worcester was favored for its inland location, safely out of the range of the British fleet. Inaccessible then, we have earned today the reputation as one of the most accessible research libraries of our type. Each year, thousands of scholars, teachers, students, writers, artists, filmmakers, and other historical researchers venture to the Society to study in these unparalleled collections, to take advantage of the expertise of our generous staff, and to participate in the vital community of scholarship which thrives here. The readers and fellows of the Society include many of the foremost scholarly historians of early American history, and I am pleased to see a number of them in our audience tonight as well. Here, readers and researchers learn from each other, not only in formal presentations like this one, but in friendly exchanges over a cup of coffee or a shared meal. For generations, the Antiquarian Society has been a place where professional and amateur historians have benefited from each other's company, as will no doubt be the case again this evening. Jill Lepore first entered into our company in the spring of 1993, when she was awarded a Peterson Fellowship to support research here at the Antiquarian Society on her dissertation at Yale University, and delightful company she has been. Jill is now Assistant Professor of History at Boston College, and, as you know, her dissertation has become a highly acclaimed new book, The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, just published by Alfred A. Knopf. The praise for her work has been extraordinary, especially for a first-time author. Reviewers have called the book brilliant, profound, and rewarding. Jill Lepore has burst onto the scholarly scene with a tour de force production, which surprises none of us who have had the pleasure of working with her. It is thus a high honor for me to present Jill Lepore on behalf of the Society as a former fellow and a fast friend. Jill?
Good evening. I'd like to thank Ellen and the Antiquarian Society for inviting me here this evening, and thank all of you, especially those of you who are standing, which is going to make me tempted to run through my words so that you can have some relief at the end of my talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. In some sense, it's a triple pleasure to be here this evening. First of all, it's great to be giving this talk here at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester because so much of King Philip's War took place in central Massachusetts. Secondly, it's great to be here because so much of my research was done here at the American Antiquarian Society. And thirdly, it's a pleasure to be here because Worcester is my hometown, and this is in many ways a homecoming for me. So again, thank you for coming. I'd like to begin this evening with a story and a paradox. One brisk autumn evening in 1831, some 200 or so Worcesterites assembled in a hall not too far from here to honor Worcester's history. After music, a parade led by the governor, and a sumptuous dinner, members of the Worcester Historical Society offered a series of prepared and to us rather peculiar toasts for the evening. They toasted the day, the personal estates of our ancestors, the old colony. They made a toast to the inhabitants of Worcester County and to the ancient dowry of a farmer's daughter, a bed, a cow, a spinning wheel, and a cradle. And they made, to me, the most peculiar toast of the evening. In 1831, these well-heeled Worcester men offered a toast to King Philip. Had we lived in the days of our forefathers, as an enemy we would have slain him, but today the present generation may safely express their respect for his patriotism. Now that last is quite a toast. And here's the paradox of it. How could these very well-heeled Worcester men so baldly declare both their admiration for Philip and their zeal to kill him if they'd had the chance? We might allow perhaps that they were a little bit more drunken at the time when they came up with this toast, but I'm not sure that that explains it fully to us. And I hope that by the end of my talk this evening, we'll have arrived at an answer to this seeming paradox. But for now, let me make explicit some of the points that I'm going to be trying to make in this evening's discussion of King Philip's War. I believe that King Philip's War shows us that how we remember wars, how those men in 1831 remembered a war from over a century earlier, how we remember wars can be just as important as how we wage them in the first place. King Philip's War nearly caused the English colonists to abandon New England entirely, nearly ended the social experiment of the Puritans' city on a hill that laid the foundations for the American nation. How those 17th century English colonists and their Indian enemies made sense of this devastating war, and how their descendants have remembered, and in some cases forgotten, that war, reveals a great deal about how American identity is formed. And it is formed, I believe, out of the sometimes gracious, sometimes awkward, sometimes brutal encounters between the peoples who come to face one another on American soil. So there will be three parts to my talk this evening. I want to talk first of all about how the war was waged, secondly about how the colonists wrote about the war, how the war was written, and finally about how the war has been remembered. King Philip's War, of course, it must be said at the outset, was named after a Wampanoag Indian sachem who took the English name of Philip and whom the colonists referred to as a king. His Indian name, his Algonquin Indian name earlier in his life was Metacom, and some records call him by that name, just for clarification's purposes. The war began in June of 1675, when three men were hanged by the neck not too far from Plymouth Rock. They had been convicted of murdering a man named John Sassaman, who weeks before his death had warned the governor of Plymouth Colony that Philip was planning to wage a war against the English settlers. The three convicted men, all Wampanoags loyal to Philip, were suspected of killing Sassaman, a Christian Indian minister who had studied at Harvard, as punishment for his betrayal. On the gallows, the two accused Wampanoags died the slow, jerky death of strangulation, but the third was saved when his rope frayed as it dangled and finally dropped him to the ground. To the Puritans it was no matter, and to the English it was no matter either, because two deaths were more than enough to start a war. Whatever his original intentions, Philip began attacking English towns on June 24th, 1675, just days after his men were hanged. Over the next 14 months, one English town was laid waste after another. In July, Middleborough, Dartmouth, Plymouth, and Mendon were attacked. Brookfield in August, Springfield, Hatfield, and Northampton in October. Then, in winter, Patuxent, Lancaster, Medfield, Groton, Longmeadow, Marlborough, Simsbury, Providence. Still more the following summer. It seemed to the colonists as if the Indians had risen almost round the country. And indeed, as the war progressed, other northeastern Algonquins, Nipmucks and Pecumtucks in central and western Massachusetts, Narragansetts in Rhode Island, and later Abnakis in Maine, joined Philip's campaign or fought the English for reasons of their own. By August of 1676, when Philip was shot to death near his home in Mount Hope, 25 English towns, more than half of all the colonists' settlements in New England, had been ruined, and the line